The playoffs are upon us. And after all those crazy dream scenarios we were talking about, it ended up being pretty anticlimactic with Brittany and Crikey just winning and getting in. Which means that Jeff, fourth most points scored on the season, and Ryan, fifth most points scored on the season, and potentially the hottest team in the league right now, both miss out on the playoffs. Let's take a look at how we got here, and then we'll talk about the playoffs at the end. First up, in a matchup that had very minor consequences, Zach's team just wasn't able to keep up, even with a big game out of Josh Allen. My team had another dominant performance and had another big week out of my running backs where I had 3 of them score over 20 points. So this is no longer a running back graveyard, and that prompted a team name and a logo change. And just as Jesus rose from the grave, so too have my team's running backs. Through multiple trades and scouring the waivers endlessly, we have been delivered to the promised land. In Najee, we trust. Amen. Now in round 2 of the irrelevant Paul versus Skip doubleheader, Paul gets the empty victory here, and probably feels like this validates his bye in some manner. Skip was so unthreatened he didn't even start a kicker in order to avoid having to drop someone this week. These two teams get to sit back and watch the peasants battle it out in the first round of the playoffs. Speaking of those playoffs, in a bid for the final spot, Jeff's team did not put together much of anything this week. He still got the win because he was facing Tim, and ultimately it didn't matter because the teams above him won. Now for Tim, in 14 weeks of the regular season, he managed to score over 100 points one time. That one time was week 10 in his only victory against Jeff. A victory which ended up being the deciding factor in Jeff not making the playoffs. And that shows how a 1-13 team, barely averaging over 80 points a week, can still have relevance. Brittany won the third deciding game between these two. And by doing so, she secures the 4 seed and ensures a 4th matchup between these two in the first round of the playoffs. This one was only close because of Tyler Lockett and the Cowboys D combining for 50 points, which was almost half of Chase's total. Brittany's team was able to overcome the Lamar injury on the back of Eckler, Fournette, and Hunter Renfrow, who's been surprisingly quite consistent down the stretch. So I wanted to see how he made his way to her team. And by scrolling down here, I found out she picked him up just days after he was dropped by none other than Paul himself. Sorry, I should have included some trigger warning there for that Kamara PTSD. Now here we have the stomp and the high score of the week all in one, and Ryan's team is in prime form right now. Dalvin Cook popping off, wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 6, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, and George Kittle is tight end 3 while missing 3 games on the season. As the person going up against the 6 seed, I can assure you I am glad Ryan did not make the playoffs. Now for Brian, he got stomped once again and jumps into first for points against on the season. And that led me to an interesting discovery, where the top 6 teams in points against all missed the playoffs, and the bottom 6 all made the playoffs, which makes it seem like it's less about how well you do and more about timing your matchups on other people's down weeks, which Paul seems to be an expert at. Last up, a matchup that looked like it was going to be close, but then ended up not being too close due to some big performances on Monday Night Football from James Conner and Matt Prater. Kelsey had another down week and was unable to stop Crikey's playoff run. However, they have Terry McLaurin, who's questionable coming into next week, so Christine's going to have a big decision on whether or not to roll the dice on Mike Williams in a do-or-die situation. And I say Christine instead of Crikey here because we all know who's making that decision. Now for the playoff matchups. We have round 4 of Chase versus Brittany. 2 fairly comparable teams, but Brittany has all the momentum right now coming off back-to-back victories. And if she can make that 3 in a row, we'll have a wonderful Skip versus Skip matchup in the semifinals. And who doesn't love an in-house rivalry? As for the other first round matchup, it's Crikey versus me, which is a little bit less even of a matchup. I've outscored them in 9 of the last 10 weeks, and arguably, one might argue that I shouldn't even be playing in this round. Both of those seem like great setups for me to throw up a dud here and find myself out of the playoffs. Whoever does make it out of this matchup will go up against Paul next week, and I hope it's me so I can deal with this fraud firsthand. I'm not going to go over the consolation bracket. Instead, to find out about the Final Four, tune into next week's Commissioner's Corner. And just so y'all can see this beauty again, here it is.